It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week begins a two-part wrap-up of the Universal Mummy series of the 1940s. Now, you might have noticed that I did not say the 30s and 40s. Well, that's because the Mummy series is the only one of the Universal Classic Monster series that up to 1944 had two distinct different continuities of sorts that it followed. 1932's The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff, follows Imhotep as he resurrects in the 20s and then returns a few years later, sans bandages, to seek the remains of his ancient mummy lover, Akhenaten. At the end of that movie, he is definitively defeated and destroyed. As the Universal horror cycle was revived after the success of 1939's Son of Frankenstein, so too was one of Universal's earliest creatures, the Mummy. However, it would be a whole different idea. Where 1932's The Mummy was a romantic nightmare, the Mummy films of the 1940s would be something slightly different. 1940s, The Mummy's Hand is a little more of an adventure film. One, I would say, serves more of an inspiration for the extremely successful 1999 film starring Brendan Fraser. 1942's The Mummy's Tomb goes forward into the future to begin by executing revenge on the previous film's heroes. Then, with this week's movie, 1944's The Mummy's Ghost, we get ourselves the first of a two-part slasher film of sorts. James Rolfe of Cinemassacre was the first person I was aware of that called the Kharis Mummy films an early version of a slasher horror film. He often has a list of calling cards of a slasher film from the perspective of the killer. The killer is typically slow-moving. He builds a body count. He often uses a weapon. He can sometimes be a supernaturally powerful character, and sometimes he's masked. If we count Kharis' own bare hands, then he checks every box. He's like an uber slasher of sorts. Between 1940's The Mummy's Hand and this film, the other constant character that appeared in the series aside from Kharis was High Priest Endoheb, played by George Zucco. This would be his final film in the series, as his character is now quite old when it comes to the timeline. This would be the second time Lon Chaney Jr. played Kharis. Tom Tyler played the character in 1940. However, in the post-Wolfman boom, it fell to Chaney to pick up the wrappings and shamble along for 3 films. It was a pretty bad experience for Chaney. The makeup process was pretty awful, and he would be so uncomfortable. He would complain of sweat pouring down his body that he couldn't wipe away. The applied makeup and prosthetics would irritate his skin, which would make him itch, but he couldn't scratch it. In a scene in this film, Chaney was to attack Frank Riker's character, Professor Norman. Chaney accidentally squeezed so hard on Riker's throat, the actor nearly fainted. It was a pretty hard production for him. Now, this film in particular does tie directly into the previous film of the series. In The Mummy's Hand, everything kicks off when our leading characters discover the tomb of Princess Ananka. That desecration and trespass was what leads to Endoheb sending Kharis out in revenge. When they are defeated, Kharis is sent out again by Endoheb 30 years later to kill those who were part of that original desecration. And then the villains are defeated once again. But one thing we never really saw was the Princess Ananka herself. The movie corrects that by casting pinup model and dancer Ramsey Ames as Amina Mansouri, who possesses the soul of Ananka. And while Ames would rarely appear in anything aside from B movies, she was a lead and often hired as a dark sultry-eyed temptress in those beef pictures. So that works quite well for her as Amina, who a woman who's constantly haunted by and needing to be protected from the shambling Kharis. She was married to Dale Wasserman for a little while, who was the playwright of the very popular and award-winning Man from La Mancha. Now, The Mummy's Ghost released on June 30, 1944, to somewhat middling reviews at the time. However, in retrospective reviews, it is considered the best of the Mummy films of the 40s by the authors of the book Universal Horrors. In fact, it was even arguably named the best of all of Universal's B pictures of that decade. Now, our penultimate entry in the Universal Mummy series begins in Egypt as Yusuf Bey, played by John Carradine, arrives at the Temple of Arkham to become a kind of brand new high priest of Arkham. The extremely old and previous high priest, Andoheb, is passing off his duties to basically in preparation to die, and he tells Yusuf Bey the story of Kharis and Princess Ananka. And half a world away in Massachusetts, Professor Norman tells his class about the tomb of Ananka. And he explains that he got a look at one of the bandages that Kharis has on him from the previous film, and explains the supposed destruction of the mummy in a fire at the end of that movie. We also get a quick refresher on the tanna leaves that makes the brew that keeps Kharis living. Now, student Tom Hervey is dating a woman of Egyptian descent, the aforementioned Amina Mansouri. She gets a little uneasy whenever Tom says anything about Egypt. She kind of freezes up. She gets really weird about Egypt. Or whenever she thinks of the place, for that matter. This typically leads to spells of absent-mindedness and exhaustion when that topic comes up. Now, back in Egypt, Andoheb tells Yusuf Bey that Kharis is still alive, and Yusuf Bey is to bring Kharis and Ananka back to Egypt. And as Yusuf Bey swears to his new assignment, he also learns about brewing the tanna leaves and how that will draw Kharis to wherever they're being brewed. Now, Professor Norman also has tanna leaves, and as he kind of messes about with them, Kharis in Massachusetts from the end of the previous movie is drawn to him. And he shambles towards Norman's home and passes by Amina's bedroom window, which stirs her from her sleep, and she follows the mummy in a trance. Kharis arrives at the professor's home and strangles the professor to death, and then drinks the brew. And Amina, seeing Kharis, snaps from her trance-like state, and she collapses unconscious outside the professor's home, which kind of gets her mixed up in the whole murder investigation for a little bit. Now, luckily, one of the investigators already realizes what's going on. There's mold on the professor's throat. The investigator then realizes that this has to be the mummy that they dealt with just not that long ago. However, they still have lots of questions for Amina, and Tom arrives to take Amina home and is surprised to see a white streak in her hair. Soon, Yusuf Bey arrives in Massachusetts, and he brews the tanna leaves, and once again, Kharis is being drawn to it. Also, near where Kharis is walking to get to Yusuf Bey, Tom and Amina have stopped to do a little, we'll just say cuddling, because I think that's all they could really do and show in 1944. But the proximity to Kharis gives her the chills, and when they leave, a kindly and friendly old farmer runs into Kharis and is killed. Later, Yusuf Bey goes to the museum to check out where Ananka's body is being kept, and late that night, he and Kharis go to retrieve the princess's body, but when Kharis touches it, Amina wakes up screaming in her bed, and the body of Princess Ananka disintegrates into dust. Yusuf Bey realizes that Ananka's soul has entered into another body, and so the gods may have just made their mission a little bit more difficult. The cops continue investigating similar murders like what has been connected to Kharis for 2 movies now. And they get a translation from the professor's house and understand that they could burn tanna leaves and brew it to draw Kharis to them so they could set a trap for him. And meanwhile, Tom convinces Amina to leave for New York with him so that they can get married. However, before they can leave in the morning, Yusuf Bey gets info from the gods as to where Ananka's soul can be found. And as the cops prepare to set their trap, this brings Kharis by Amina's bedroom once again, which beckons her to follow the mummy. And when Kharis sees her, he realizes right away that she's the one he's looking for. And seeing him causes Amina to faint, and he carries her off. Now, Tom is quick to follow Kharis, who is no longer heading for the trap set by the police, but back to Yusuf Bey. As is always the case in these Kharis movies, the priest ends up falling in love with the beautiful woman that Kharis has captured. And when he plans to keep Amina for himself and give her tanna leaves to restore her youth and beauty, Kharis goes nuts with anger. Kharis kills the priest and stops Tom from trying to stop him, and hearing a mob approaching to stop him, Kharis carries Amina off, and as they enter a swamp, we see Amina's body is quickly aging. Soon, Kharis and a really old-looking Amina get stuck in the swamp and sink into their doom. Now let's talk about the 3 things I like about The Mummy's Ghost. First, this is about as easy breezy of a watch as you can get. Now never mind the obvious, that this being a 60-minute movie. It's really more than that. Beyond that really short time frame, the pace for the movie is rather brisk. It makes for a pretty lean and mean movie. There's no wasted minute in the film. I mean, we open the movie with a couple of minutes of refresher in Egypt and Massachusetts to kind of catch us up from what's happened previously in the Kharis saga. Then we meet our main characters, Tom and Amina. Soon our villains pop up, Kharis and Yusuf Bey, and they go to get Ananka's body, but they find that her soul needs to be retrieved as well. I mean, that's just the first half of the movie. But it keeps that kind of snappy pace and gets to the point. For the 3rd film in the Kharis series, it could have really been bogged down with a lot of stuff in the previous movies, and then introducing Amina as Ananka's reincarnated soul, blah, blah, blah. It could have really been bogged down by a lot of exposition. But the snappy pace makes this incredibly watchable. Second, I love that the cops are actually really intelligent to find a guy who can, 1, translate the inscription inside the tomb of Ananka, 2, translate information that Professor Norman had, and 3, how they can kind of use the tanna leaves to set the trap for Kharis. Now, it doesn't really work, but normally you spend a lot of time with the cops spinning their wheels about not believing in the mystical stuff going on. But here, they're on it. And they actually do the right thing to get something that is meant to trap the mummy. And it's really good work. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with the fact that this does pick up directly from the previous movie. But it's really kind of nice to see cops actually, working towards a solution instead of being an impediment. But thirdly, while it is basically tradition at this point to have the priest fall in love with the leading lady of this movie absolutely breaks from the tradition by having the leading lady actually die. That's freaking brilliant. Each time Amina has been drawn out by Kharis, her hair grows white streaks and eventually goes totally white. That's because, she's aging. She's becoming Ananka. She was always doomed, but we don't realize that until the end of the movie. I'm not sure that there was ever a chance to save her, and I suppose if the priest of Arkham were totally wiped out, she would have gone on to live a normal life. But her dying in the end seems to have always been what was supposed to have happened. It's actually a wonderful surprise to have the hero kind of heartbroken and his gal dead at the end of this movie. It kind of does a good job of kind of subverting the typical expectation at the end of one of these monster movies. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to the Film Seizure at various places where you can find podcast providers across the web, as well as YouTube. And that's where you can get your Film Seizure podcast and the Monster Monday podcast on Mondays and Wednesdays each week. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, the Universal Mummy movies are concluded with the final Kharis film, The Mummy's Curse. Until next week, stay spooky.